The Night of Whispers. Antonio had been a gravedigger at the Cemetery of Souls for over 30 years. Nothing surprised him anymore, or so he thought. On a cold autumn night, as he was closing the rusty gates, he heard a whisper coming from behind an old tombstone.
E Antonio. Antonio.
He tried to ignore it, convincing himself it was just the wind. But the whisper grew stronger, more insistent.
E Antonio.
Help us. With trembling hands, Antonio grabbed his flashlight and shone it in the direction of the sound. What he saw made his blood run cold. Dozens of pale, skeletal hands were emerging from the ground, clawing at the soil in desperation. The gravedigger tried to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. The whispers turned into screams, echoing throughout the cemetery. The tombstones began to tremble, and more hands emerged from the ground. Antonio, paralyzed with terror, watched helplessly as more and more hands surfaced. The cemetery ground seemed to undulate, as if it were a sea of restless souls. Summoning all his courage, Antonio finally managed to move. He ran toward the small office near the entrance, stumbling over roots and stones along the way. The screams grew louder, now mixed with the sound of earth being disturbed and tombstones cracking. Reaching the office, Antonio locked the door and collapsed into his worn-out chair, panting. His cell phone had no signal. He was alone. Suddenly, a dull thud on the window made him jump. A cadaverous hand was tapping on the glass, leaving slimy marks. Through the fogged-up window, Antonio saw a figure forming. It was Mr. Rodriguez, buried the previous week.
E Antonio.
Mr. Rodriguez's hoarse voice echoed, "You promised to take care of us. You betrayed us." The gravedigger tried to remember. Yes, he had promised Mr. Rodriguez on his deathbed that he would take care of his grave. But with the recent increase in burials, he hadn't had time. The window started to crack. More figures joined Mr. Rodriguez, all with accusing looks. Antonio recognized faces of people he had buried over the years. "You don't understand," he cried desperately. "I did the best I could." But the tormented souls didn't seem to hear. The window finally gave way. With the shattering of the window, a wave of cold, putrid air flooded the office. Antonio cowered in a corner, watching in horror as spectral figures materialized before him. It wasn't just Mr. Rodriguez and the recent dead, there were dozens, perhaps hundreds of souls, some so old their forms were just shadowy blurs. "You don't understand," Antonio repeated, his voice trembling. "I always did my best to honor all of you." A woman in Victorian clothing stepped forward, her opaque eyes fixed on Antonio.
¿Y honor?
"You call this honor? My grave is covered in weeds, my name almost erased by time." Another specter, a soldier in a World War II uniform, pointed a bony hand at the gravedigger. "My Medal of Honor was stolen years ago. You never bothered to replace it." The accusations continued, each soul revealing a neglect, a forgetfulness, a broken promise. Antonio felt the weight of decades of neglect bearing down on his shoulders. He had become a gravedigger out of respect for the dead, but over the years, the job had become just a routine. As the souls advanced, Antonio closed his eyes, expecting the worst. But then, a different voice cut through the chorus of laments. Wait. Antonio opened his eyes. A girl, no more than 10 years old, dressed in early 20th century clothing, stood between him and the crowd of spirits. "Remember how he took care of me?" she asked, her voice echoing with a wisdom beyond her apparent age. "When everyone forgot me, he still brought flowers." The spirits hesitated. Antonio recognized the girl. It was Maria, buried in 1918, a victim of the Spanish flu. Her grave was in an isolated corner of the cemetery, but Antonio always made sure to keep it clean and with fresh flowers. Encouraged by Maria's intervention, Antonio stood up. "I made mistakes, it's true. but it was never out of malice or neglect. This cemetery, you are my life. I just couldn't keep up with everything. Mr. Rodriguez, who seemed to be the leader of the spirits, looked at Antonio with less hostility. Then why didn't you ask for help? Why did you let things get to this point? Antonio lowered his head. Pride, I guess. And fear. Fear of admitting I was getting too old for the job, fear that someone younger would replace me and you would be forgotten. A murmur ran through the crowd of spirits. Some seemed to understand, others were still resentful. Maria turned to them. He deserves a chance, she said. We all made mistakes in life. In death, we should be more understanding. There was a long moment of silence. Then, slowly, Mr. Rodriguez nodded.
E a chance, Antônio.
Do we have a deal? Antonio swallowed hard and nodded. Yes, a deal. I will fix everything, I promise. But I will need help. In the days that followed, the townspeople were intrigued by the changes in the cemetery. Antonio hired a team of young people to help him, teaching them about the history of each section, each important grave. Weeds were removed, tombstones cleaned, and flowers planted. And at night, when the cemetery was closed to the living, Antonio talked to the dead. He listened to their stories, their regrets, their unfulfilled wishes. He became not just a gravedigger, but a guardian of memories. Years passed. Antonio grew older, but continued his work with renewed dedication. And when his time finally came, he was not afraid. He crossed the cemetery gates one last time, not as a gravedigger, but as another soul to be cared for. Around him, hundreds of spirits greeted him, not with anger or accusations, but with gratitude and respect. Maria, the girl who had defended him years ago, reached out her hand to him. Welcome to your true home, Antonio, she said with a smile. Now it's our turn to take care of you. And so, Antonio joined those he had cared for all his life, finally at peace with both the living and the dead. Though the new gravediggers and visitors to the cemetery couldn't see it, on nights of the full moon, it said you can hear whispers of friendly conversations and distant laughter echoing among the tombstones, the dead and their guardian, united forever in their shared stories. Years passed, and the Cemetery of Souls gained a peculiar reputation in the town. People spoke of the unique atmosphere of the place, a mix of peace and melancholy that seemed to touch the soul of anyone who entered. Lucas, the young gravedigger who took over Antonio's place, noticed strange things from his first day. Objects moved during the night, fresh flowers appeared on long-forgotten graves, and sometimes he swore he heard voices whispering when he was alone. One night, as he was closing the gates, Lucas saw a familiar figure near the old oak tree. It was Antonio, or at least it looked like him, younger and more vigorous than Lucas remembered.
E Antônio.
Lucas called out, hesitant. The figure smiled and waved, then disappeared. Lucas rubbed his eyes, convincing himself he was too tired and imagining things. But the strange events continued. Lucas began finding notes written in an old-fashioned handwriting, alerting him about graves that needed repairs or suggesting improvements in the cemetery. The notes were always signed with a simple EA. Intrigued and a bit scared, Lucas decided to investigate. He spent nights in the cemetery, hidden among the shadows, waiting to see something out of the ordinary. On a new moon night, his patience was rewarded. Lucas saw dozens of ethereal forms emerging from the graves, talking and laughing like old friends at a gathering. In the center of the group was Antonio, now clearly a spirit like the others. Lucas watched, open-mouthed, as Antonio led the spirits in a sort of meeting. They discussed the state of the cemetery, shared stories of their lives and afterlives, and even planned small interventions to help the living who visited the place. Gathering all his courage, Lucas stepped out of his hiding place.
E Antônio.
Is it really you? The spectral figures turned to him, surprised. Antonio stepped forward, his gentle smile the same as when he was alive. Lucas, my boy, he said, his voice echoing strangely. I thought you'd never have the courage to reveal yourself. You knew I was here? Lucas stammered.
Antônio Laugued.
Of course we did. We know everything that happens in this cemetery. It is our home, after all. In the months that followed, Lucas became the link between the two worlds. He learned from Antonio and the other spirits, listening to their stories and helping to fulfill their last wishes. The Cemetery of Souls became a place of healing, not only for the dead, but also for the living. People who had lost loved ones reported feelings of comfort and peace when visiting. Some even swore they saw their deceased relatives smiling at them among the tombstones. The cemetery's fame spread. Historians came to research the lives of those buried there, guided by mysterious hunches that led to surprising discoveries. Artists drew inspiration from the unique atmosphere, creating works that captured the delicate boundary between life and death. But with fame came those with less noble intentions. One day, a real estate developer arrived with plans to demolish part of the cemetery to build a shopping center. Lucas was desperate, knowing what this would mean not only for the dead, but for the special balance that had been created there. He tried to argue with the authorities, but his young voice was ignored. The night before the scheduled demolition, Lucas went to the cemetery, determined to do something, anything, to stop the destruction. To his surprise, he found Antonio and the other spirits already gathered. Don't worry, Lucas, Antonio said with a mysterious smile. We'll take care of this. That night, the entire town was awakened by an inexplicable phenomenon. Mysterious lights danced above the cemetery, forming hypnotic shapes and patterns. The sound of ethereal music echoed through the streets, touching the hearts of all who heard it. When dawn arrived, the developer and his demolition team found hundreds of citizens forming a human chain around the cemetery. People of all ages and social classes, united to protect that sacred place. Confronted with such a demonstration of community unity, the developer had no choice but to abandon his plans. The Cemetery of Souls was declared a historical site, protected by law. Lucas, now recognized as its official guardian, worked tirelessly to preserve its legacy. And on quiet nights, when the moon shone over the old tombstones, Lucas would join Antonio and the other spirits, sharing stories, laughter, and the peace that only exists when the worlds of the living and the dead meet in harmony. The cemetery continued to be a place of mystery and comfort, a reminder that death is not the end, but just another phase of an eternal journey. And Antonio, the old gravedigger turned spiritual guardian, smiled, knowing that his work and his legacy would continue for many generations to come. As the years passed, the Cemetery of Souls became more than just a resting place for the dead. It became a sanctuary, a meeting point between two worlds. Lucas, now middle-aged, continued his role as guardian, but began to feel the weight of the responsibility. One night, while talking with Antonio and the other spirits, Lucas expressed his concern. "And when I'm gone," he asked, "who will continue this work?" Antonio smiled, his ethereal face glowing under the moonlight. "The cemetery always finds its guardian, Lucas. Just as it found you." That same week, a young woman named Sofia began visiting the cemetery regularly. She was a history student, fascinated by the lives of those buried there. Lucas watched her from a distance, noticing how she treated each grave with respect, sometimes speaking softly to the tombstones. One day, Sofia approached Lucas. "Sorry to bother you," she said, "but I have the strangest feeling when I'm here. It's like the place is alive." Lucas exchanged a glance with Antonio's spirit, who was nearby, invisible to Sofia. He nodded, encouraging Lucas. "Sofia," Lucas began, "there's much more to this cemetery than you can imagine." In the following weeks, Lucas gradually introduced Sofia to the secrets of the Cemetery of Souls. She was shocked at first, but her curiosity and compassion soon overcame her fear. Sofia began helping Lucas with his tasks, learning not only about the physical upkeep of the cemetery, but also how to communicate and care for the spirits that inhabited it. Meanwhile, the world around the cemetery continued to change. The city grew, technology advanced. One day, a team of paranormal researchers arrived, equipped with state-of-the-art devices to detect supernatural activity. Lucas and Sofia were apprehensive. Exposing the true nature of the cemetery could jeopardize the peace of the spirits. But stopping the investigation could raise suspicions. Antonio and the other spirits decided to take charge of the situation. During the investigation, they manifested in subtle ways. Whispers barely audible, light touches like a breeze, fleeting shapes in the corners of eyes. The researchers were intrigued, but could not find conclusive evidence. The Cemetery of Souls retained its air of mystery, continuing to be a place of solace and wonder, protected by the living and the dead who called it home. And as Lucas and Sofia worked side by side, the legacy of Antonio and the many spirits who had come before them lived on, ensuring that the cemetery would remain a sanctuary for generations to come. However, one of the researchers, a skeptical man named Ricardo, was not satisfied. He began making unauthorized nighttime visits, determined to prove the existence of the supernatural. On one of these nights, Ricardo went too far. He brought a medium, hoping to force a communication with the spirits. The result was chaotic. The veil between the worlds momentarily tore, causing a supernatural storm that threatened to expose everything. Lucas and Sofia rushed to the cemetery, finding Ricardo and the medium in a state of shock, surrounded by agitated spirits. Antonio was trying to calm the situation, but it was clear that something needed to be done. Sofia, guided by an intuition she didn't fully understand, began to sing an old lullaby that her grandmother had taught her. Her voice, soft and melodious, seemed to soothe both the living and the dead. Slowly, the supernatural storm subsided. When everything calmed down, Ricardo looked at Lucas and Sofia with a mixture of fear and admiration. What is this place? Lucas sighed. It is a place of rest, of memory, and of transition. And it needs to be protected. In the days that followed, Lucas and Sofia worked to minimize the damage. Ricardo, deeply affected by the experience, agreed to keep secret what he had witnessed. He even offered to help protect the cemetery, using his influence to divert future unwanted investigations. This incident marked a turning point. Lucas realized he couldn't keep the Cemetery of Souls isolated from the modern world forever. With the help of Sofia, Antonio, and the other spirits, he began to develop new ways to protect the site while allowing it to evolve. They created educational programs, teaching about the cemetery's history and the importance of respecting the dead. They organized carefully planned guided tours, allowing people to feel the unique atmosphere of the place without disturbing its spectral inhabitants. Sofia, with her knowledge of history and her sensitivity to the supernatural, became an essential part of this new phase. She began cataloging the spirit stories, creating an archive that preserved not only the facts, but also the emotions and experiences of those who had passed on. As Lucas grew older, he saw in Sofia the future guardian of the Cemetery of Souls. She had learned to balance respect for the past with adaptation to the present, a crucial skill for keeping the cemetery relevant and protected in a constantly changing world. And so, the Cemetery of Souls continued its journey through time. A place where past and present met, where the living could find comfort, and the dead, peace. A constant reminder that death is not an end, but a transition, and that the stories we leave behind are as important as the lives we live. Under the watchful eyes of its guardians, both living and dead, the Cemetery of Souls remained a beacon of hope and mystery, a portal between worlds that would continue to inspire and intrigue for generations to come. Decades passed. Sofia, now a gray-haired lady, was sitting in her office at the cemetery when she felt a change in the air. The sky suddenly darkened, and a cold wind blew through the tombstones. Antonio appeared, his spectral face more serious than ever. Sofia, it's time. The great crossing is coming. The Great Crossing was a legend among the spirits, a rare event when the barriers between the world of the living and the dead became so thin that they could completely break. Sofia called together her team of guardians, including Ricardo, now an elderly ally, and her apprentice, the young Luana. Together, they began preparations for what would be the greatest challenge the Cemetery of Souls had ever faced. At midnight, the sky opened up. An aurora of supernatural colors danced over the cemetery. The gates creaked and opened on their own, and a thick mist began to spread through the city. Spirits from all eras began to emerge, not just from the Cemetery of Souls, but from all corners of the world. It was a breathtaking sight, ancient warriors marching alongside modern scientists, children from past eras holding hands with newly deceased elders. Sofia and her team worked tirelessly to maintain order. Luana used her voice, inherited from Sofia, to sing ancient songs of protection. Ricardo coordinated with city authorities, keeping the living safe and away. But the tide of souls was immense. The boundary between the worlds was unraveling, and chaos threatened to ensue. It was then that Sofia had an epiphany. She didn't need to fight the crossing, she needed to guide it. With the help of Antonio and the oldest spirits, Sofia began an ancient, almost forgotten ritual. She summoned the essence of the cemetery itself, the accumulated memories of countless lives and deaths. A bright light emanated from the center of the cemetery, rising to the sky like a beacon. Sofia felt the power flowing through her, connecting her to every soul, living or dead. With a gesture, she created a spectral bridge, a path of light that stretched to the horizon and beyond. It was a bridge between worlds, a pathway for lost souls to find their way. The spirits began to cross the bridge, some going, others returning. It was a spectacle of farewells and reunions, of closure and new beginnings. When the last spirit crossed, Sofia, exhausted but triumphant, turned to her team. Her eyes shone with a new understanding. The Cemetery of Souls was never just a place, she said. It is a guardian, a guide. And we are its keepers. With dawn, the bridge of light dissipated. The city woke up, many of its inhabitants with hazy memories of strange and beautiful dreams. The Cemetery of Souls had changed. Now it emanated an aura of power and purpose that everyone could feel. It became a place of pilgrimage, not only to mourn the dead, but to celebrate the eternal cycle of existence. Sofia, knowing her time as guardian was coming to an end, gathered Luana and the others. Our task is greater than we ever imagined, she said. We are the guardians not only of the cemetery, but of the balance between life and death. As the sun set on that historic day, Sofia looked to the horizon, where the bridge of light had been. She felt Antonio beside her, along with all the souls who had passed through. We are ready, she whispered, both to herself and to the universe. For whatever comes next. And so, the Cemetery of Souls entered a new era, its secrets revealed, its purpose clear. A beacon of hope and a reminder that death is not the end but a passage that, thanks to its dedicated keepers, would always be illuminated, always guided, always respected. The echoes of past lives and the promise of future ones resonated through the tombstones, an eternal symphony of existence, with the Cemetery of Souls as its everlasting conductor.